So I've been paying attention to the meta, as is my job, and I've concluded, well, concluded is a strong word. I've narrowed down the scope of the different aggro decks available in this set that are currently what I would call at least tier 3, tier 2, some maybe even being tier 1. We're still too early on the set to actually say any of this stuff definitively because we've just not had any tournaments, so until more tournaments come out and more results start happening, knowing where all of these decks place in the current set is going to be pretty non-deterministic until then. Before we get into the rest of the video, like, subscribe, and go check out the rest of the links in the bottom of the description. Okay, bye. So what are these aggro decks I'm talking about? Well, we've got two new ones, Lady and the Tramp, Burn Baby Burn. Wait, I should be using these ones. Two returning favorites, Diggy Diggy and Tax Evasion, although Tax Evasion, draw aggro, whatever, we'll get into that. And then just updated list of Amber Amethyst that I've made in the past. All of these decks at this point in time are shockingly well positioned, and I couldn't really tell you why because a lot of these decks kind of hate Bell with a burning passion, right? Bell has been the thorn in all of these aggro decks, or at least what my aggro deck was, since her inception, and since she's been discovered to be about as strong as everyone was hyping her up to be. Now, thankfully, she's not an unfallible god. First off, your opponent needs to be drawing the Fortisphere Popsicle combo in the first place. And second off, they are still having to just play, they only go down one in card advantage, but they do need to sacrifice an item, which gets rid of some of their synergy with Haram later on into the game and stuff like that, right? So Belle hasn't been the death sentence that I initially thought she was going to be. Especially because if we go look over at my improved list, I'm still experimenting. Don't take this list with a grain of salt. I'm not done playtesting yet, but we have these new cards in the Prince, Vigilant Suitor, and Honey Marin, a North Ultra Guide. Can you see this well? It's fine. When you play this character, if an opponent has a character in play, gain one lore. She just fits so naturally into the deck because if you remember, had been complaining about finding a replacement for Piglet for the longest time. And I tried so many different cards and just ended up not really finding anything better than Madame Mim Snake. But Honey Mare and North Ultra Guide is that replacement. It's now just a reliable extra card to gain lore on play, which is kind of what you want your 2-drops to be in this deck, where you play them in order to try and gain free lore later on in the game. I'll get more into that when I eventually make a video on updated hyper aggro. This is just presenting all of the different aggro options to my dear viewers. Long and short of it, there's now answers or ways around Bell in these aggro decks. We can go through them one by one. I need to open up this one. Lady and the Tramp aggro just forces, like with Curse Merfolk, Daisy Duck, Nala, these characters don't die to Bell, or Curse Merfolk forces your opponent to go down in card advantage if they swing into it with Bell. You also just have the Pegasus and the Little John and Go Go Tamago. You just like have ways around the Bell in this deck. And of course, this is a board flood deck that eventually is trying to play these bigger characters to just overwhelm your opponent with like Chernobog, Tramp, blah blah blah, yada yada. This is probably one of the newer, stronger aggro decks to have come out of set 7. There was never really a deck that was able to take full advantage of Chernobog before this one, which is a real shame because Chernobog theoretically is very strong into aggro decks because it's just like, oh, they've killed off all my characters. Let me create this massive problem for my opponent to deal with. Now, with Tramp, Street Smart, Dog, we actually have enough synergy pieces to reliably get Chernobog off and even get Chernobog off several times. I'm gonna have to experiment with this list myself. The reason why I don't go all in on it is because I do not have access to Rapunzel, and one of the things I consider when building my decks is the accessibility of actually buying them. Uh, at least for myself, I'm obviously like I made item embezzlement like what last week, and that deck is $600. You get what I mean. For decks I'm considering playing myself, I have to take into consideration when there's a $50 legendary in the mix. So there's no better time to talk about this deck. Now, this deck kind of immediately folds under the other aggro decks. It just doesn't have enough tools to beat them at their own game, right? This deck is just trying to tempo out and gain a lot of these free lore generators and then trying to slow down your opponent slightly with stuff like Giant Cobra and Madam Mim Snake, and also Pete and Fire to Cannons. Certainly not a bad deck, but Amethyst, Chromacon, and stuff like that has always been awkward to run in decks, period. Just because giving your opponent card advantage while not really going without a huge payoff for yourself has never been great. What makes this deck good though is just like we've now reached critical mass of characters that gain lore upon entry in this color combo with things like Honeymar and North Ultra Guide and the new snake. I don't know why it doesn't load properly like that, and the new giant cobra and the P, and Benja is also very nice in this current meta with all of the items floating around. Definitely experiment with this deck if you have the ability to, because it's fairly cheap, but eh, I get it. I understand. These docks are expensive, man. But like the rest of the deck is actually fairly cheap. Just Maleficent and Doc are accounting for what? Literally 50% of the budget of the deck. So you can just proxy out those seven and then just be fine running the rest of the deck, right? Moving on to the complete polar opposite of that spectrum, though, we have Diggy Diggy, or Diggy Doggy now, which it's always been a fun aggro deck just because of the amount of agency the deck actually gives you with stuff like Strength of a Raging Fire, Let the Storm Rage On, and Seven Dwarfs Mine. It's certainly a lot more of a mid-range deck than it is an aggro deck where you're just trying to play high value characters and outvaluing your opponent in a sort of grind of the game and trying to come out the other end the victor. Very expensive deck. I can't build it myself because once again, this Rapunzel is here. Obviously, this list is running the enchanteds. You don't need the enchanteds, of course. It takes into account the cheaper version, so it is still actually $420. Because Strength of a Raging Fire is getting kind of crazy expensive. But anyways, if you're looking for a very strong, stable aggro deck, Amber Steel, a version like this is probably a good way to go because Amber Steel has proven itself time and time again, and I will be shocked if it doesn't prove itself again in this meta. Then finally, we move on to my pet deck that I've made for this set, Tax Evasion, Evasive Aggro. Uh, it's a deck archetype that's actually existed for a long time, ever since Pascal and Pegasus were out at the same time. People were like, oh, hold on, can't we just play a bunch of evasive characters? And the answer is yes, you can, but it kind of ended up being bad because, of course, the problem with evasive characters were their stat lines were very awful most of the time. However, that's changed with Iago Giant Spectral Parrot. I don't know why I'm doing it this way. Let me it's probably better viewing this way. Iago being a 4/6 evasive vanish as well, of course, but there's ways around that. Really helped this deck actually find a place in the meta for itself, especially when you combo it with Peter Pan's Shadowfinder. I've already talked about this deck in a YouTube video. You can go watch that YouTube video for more information. Just know that this is the deck I've been practicing the most with and have seen the most success with because it actually has a very favorable matchup spread against everything except like amber steel pretty much, even like ruby sapphire or sapphire steel kiwi birds and all of these other decks, even aggro decks can kind of fold to it pretty easily if you get the right curve out. I had to include Rafiki Mystical Fighter in order to make the aggro matchup more manageable. I've cut the Diablo Obedient Raven for him. Just because if you were ever on the draw with this deck and didn't have the ideal curve out against an aggro deck, you just kind of lost on the spot. So I've added in this option early game to actually have an answer to your opponent's early game stuff. So yeah, that's about all of the aggro decks I know of right now that I can recommend in confidence to you, my dear viewer, because I've seen all of these different aggro decks succeed to various different degrees. Which one will come out on top by the end of like 3 weeks from now? Ooh, who's to say? It's early days. It's not easy to say, oh, this version of hyper aggro. There's only like one version of hyper aggro. Actually, Burn Baby Burn is also hyper aggro, but semantics. It doesn't even matter. But knowing I can't predict the future, it's going to be hard to tell which version of aggro ends up on top. I do hope it is my pet aggro deck that I've been refining for 3 sets now, but there's always a chance that's not the case. So with that, I bid you adieu. Adieu. I can say French words. Adieu. Uh don't forget to hit like and subscribe, although I already did that section. And yeah, I'll catch you all in the next one.